Inmate violence getting thick and continues to occur daily, injuring both staff and inmates along the way, representatives with the New York State Correctional Officers and Police Benevolent Association said. Over the course of 2 weeks in late February and early March, 3 separate incidents at Clinton Correctional Facility left multiple officers injured and exposed to blood and an inmate with multiple puncture wounds from a stabbing. The first incident at the maximum security prison happened February 25 when a sergeant and an officer were injured after an inmate attacked them twice at the facility during an unruly and non-compliant trip for medical services. The altercation left one officer with a hand gash laceration and the sergeant hit in the face and neck, requiring transport to the University of Vermont Health Network CVPH hospital for treatment. On March 5, an inmate attacked another incarcerated individual with a makeshift weapon, stabbing him multiple times in the head and neck. The next day, a sergeant and 2 officers were injured and exposed to blood when a combative inmate attacked them and spat blood in their face. The inmate, who was serving a 20-year sentence after being convicted for first-degree burglary, refused to lock his cell after returning from the mess hall and grew violent with the officers, struggling against body holds, spitting blood, attempting to bite staff and elbowing them in the face. While some officers were treated by medical staff at the facility, the sergeant and 1 officer required treatment at CVPH. In condemning the continued violence, NYSCOT Northern Region Vice President John Roberts said, as we approach the implementation of the Hall legislation, my fear is these type of attacks will only increase with the inability to properly discipline violent inmates who attack staff and other inmates. By the time Hall goes into effect, these 3 violent inmates involved in the 3 incidents at Clinton will be back in general population with the ability to attack again, with little or no deterrence. All Hall will do, and the elected officials who supported this ill-conceived legislation have done, is create a more dangerous environment for everyone. Assemblyman Billy Jones also recently spoke out saying the state needs to address the continuing rise in prison violence. I worked in corrections for 20 years and understand how dangerous working at a correctional facility can be. The recent spike in prison violence, including the most recent incident at Clinton Correctional, is unacceptable and the problem is only escalating. There are serious concerns about how the HALT Act will further increase violence at correctional facilities, and that is one of the many reasons why I voted against it, Jones said in March 14 statement. I also have passed legislation to help keep our correctional facilities safe, including ending double bunking in facilities across the state. The workers at North Country Correctional Facilities were deemed essential during the pandemic, and they deserve to be safe. The state needs to propose actual solutions to remedy this problem, and it is why I am a proud co-sponsor of a bill, a 7588, to create a commission to study prison violence that will be required to come up with solutions to address this issue. The hardworking folks at correctional facilities are counting on the state to take action, and we must do something before more people are seriously hurt, or even worse, killed. An inmate accused of knocking a correction officer unconscious and fracturing his jaw at Clinton Correctional Facility last spring has been charged in connection with the incident following a grand jury indictment December 13. The union representing correctional officers said in April that the inmate, 25-year-old Ali Sis, is serving a 12-year prison sentence for an armed robbery charge from 2014. The union said Sis had attacked the officer in the prison's recreation yard shortly after 8 p.m. before attempting to blend in with other inmates afterward. The inmate was identified by staff shortly after. State police said Sis had confronted the officer before punching him in the head and face. Another correctional officer saw the officer drop to the ground. The officer was unconscious by the time fellow officers arrived to him. The officer was taken to a local hospital, where he was treated for 2 jaw fractures and bruising and swelling around the eyes. Sis was charged with second-degree assault, a felony, after the Clinton County grand jury's indictment on December 13. Sadly, violence against staff has become the norm, and our members face that danger each and every day they step foot inside a facility, John Roberts, Northern Region Vice President of the New York State Correctional Officers and Police Benevolent Association, said in a statement. 2 Clinton County Correctional Facility officers were seriously injured on Thursday morning after being attacked by an inmate, according to the New York State Correctional Officers and Police Benevolent Association, NYSCOT. Officials tell us the inmate threw hot oil onto an officer. Another officer who tried to assist was also attacked. More fights break out at the Clinton Correctional Facility, injuring 2 inmates, just days after guards were attacked. On Tuesday, an officer who was assigned to the recreation yard saw 3 inmates fighting and tried to break it up. The inmates ignored direct orders. The officer saw one of the inmates making multiple slashing motions at another inmate. Staff used pepper spray, and the inmates were under control. The 3 inmates were handcuffed, removed from the yard, and got medical attention. One inmate had been slashed on both sides of his head with an undisclosed weapon. The other two were not injured. Later on, more fights broke out, and orders were ignored to break it up. Pepper spray was used, and the fighting stopped. Then, all the inmates were removed from the yard. Injured inmates got medical attention, with one inmate getting cuts on his head and puncture wounds on his cheek. New York's solitary confinement reform in state prisons continues to draw criticism by correctional officers as it nears implementation at the end of the month. The Humane Alternatives to Long-Term Solitary Confinement Act will limit the number of days an inmate can spend in isolation to 15, exclude the punishment of solitary confinement for vulnerable inmates, introduce alternate rehabilitation measures and give due process protections for inmates that will prohibit placement in isolation units before disciplinary hearing. A record high in reported assaults against corrections staff with a dwindling inmate population, the union representing New York correctional officers fears that restricting the use of disciplinary measures will put more officers and staff at risk. In the last 3 weeks, the New York State Correctional Officers and Police Benevolent Association said multiple officers and one inmate sustained injuries in 3 separate incidents at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora. One incident in late February involved an inmate reportedly attacking a sergeant and an officer after handcuffs were removed so he could be evaluated in an infirmary room. In early March, one inmate repeatedly struck another inmate in the face with a sharpened toothbrush in the mess hall. And a day later, the union said, a sergeant and 2 officers were injured after an inmate punched, elbowed and spat blood in the face of an officer after he reportedly became combative. My fear is these types of attacks will only increase with the inability to properly discipline violent inmates who attack staff and other inmates, Scott, the Northern Region Vice President John Roberts said in a news release. By the time Hall goes into effect, these 3 violent inmates involved in the 3 incidents at Clinton will be back in general population with the ability to attack again, with little or no deterrence. All Hall will do, and the elected officials who supported this ill-conceived legislation have done, is create a more dangerous environment for everyone. Clinton Correctional Facility was placed on lockdown Wednesday following a fight that broke out among inmates in the facility's North Yard, union officials said. The fight, which numbered about 24 inmates, follows reports of similar incidents occurring in the prison earlier this week. Multiple correctional emergency response teams responded to Clinton Correctional following. There has always been the occasional very troubling incident, the trend I am seeing of late, in terms of sheer savagery of the assault, the randomness of the assault, and the lack of any precipitating event before the assault, is extremely disturbing. This will not be tolerated, Acting Commissioner Anthony Annucci wrote. Additional correction officers were called in and a type of gas agent was fired into the North Yard at Clinton Correctional Facility during an incident Saturday night. New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision said the incident was handled and there were no injuries. Officers could be seen arriving and rushing into the prison shortly after 8 p.m., and the sound of apparent weapon fire could be heard in the heart of the village. Several people ignored rain and lightning to gather outside the prison walls to watch and listen. Officers in the towers overlooking the inside of the prison could be seen with weapons drawn. A haze of what appeared to be smoke wafted in the air over the prison as the night wore on, indicating gas had been fired. New York State Corrections Officers Police Benevolent Association Northern Region Vice President John Roberts told the Press Republican that additional officers were called in to quell a disturbance among inmates in the yard that started around 5 p.m. Roberts said that chemical agents were fired into the yard. Inmates who had served time at the Clinton Correctional Facility here tell of being taken aside by a sergeant soon after they arrive and given a warning. Cross the guards, and bad things can happen. And they do. Inmates describe being ambushed by guards and beaten, taunted with racial slurs, and kept out of sight, in solitary confinement, until the injuries inflicted on them have healed enough to avoid arousing suspicion. One story in particular has been passed along over the last few years as a kind of parable of brutality and injustice on the Kleinblocks. Leonard Strickland was a prisoner with schizophrenia who got into an argument with guards, and ended up dead. In the inmate's telling, the guards got away with murder, ganging up on Mr. Strickland and beating him so viciously that he could barely move. The guards denied this, saying they acted only in self-defense and did what was necessary to subdue an out-of-control prisoner. In a security video obtained by the New York Times, Mr. Strickland is seen in handcuffs, barely conscious and being dragged along the floor by officers, while a prison nurse standing close by does nothing. Even as he lies face down on the floor, near death, guards can be heard shouting, "Stop resisting!" By the time an ambulance arrived, medical records described Mr. Strickland's body as cold to the touch and covered in cuts and bruises, with blood flowing from his ears. Lawsuit was filed by a former female correctional officer at the county jail, which is part of the sheriff's department in Clinton County. The lawsuit says Dominique Balleras started her job at the Clinton County Jail as a corrections officer in March 2019, and that is when the harassment began. It says Corey Breen would send her unsolicited text messages, and when she ignored them, he would message her on Facebook. March 2020, when Balleras says Breen grabbed her as he tried to pull his pants down. Clinton Correctional Facility is on lockdown after acts of violence in the prison on Thursday and Friday. New York Corrections spokesman Thomas Maley confirmed several people were injured in those incidents. Thursday, 5 inmates were treated at the facility and 1 was taken to a local hospital. Maley says on Friday, 3 staffers were taken to the hospital with minor injuries and 1 inmate is being treated at the facility hospital. Inmate broke Cole's jaw. Officer sustained 2 fractures to the jaw, bruising and swelling around the eyes after he was knocked unconscious by an inmate. Inmate, who was serving a 16-year manslaughter sentence, reportedly attacked the Cole in the recreation yard. Another saw his co-worker drop to the ground in the north yard after the alleged assault, the union continued. The Cole was unconscious by the time staff arrived and was brought to the medical facilities in the prison before being transported to a local hospital, New Scott said. A report detailing violence and abuse against inmates at the maximum security prison. The Correctional Association of New York report Voices from Clinton alleges that a culture of violence and abuse against prisoners has existed at Clinton Correctional for years. Climate has become extremely violent for those who work inside those concrete walls. Assaults on staff have increased by almost 60% over the past 5 years statewide. The statement continues. The Correctional Association conducted their research based on interviews with 75 inmates who couldn't live within the rules of society. These are individuals who in many cases have committed violent, heinous acts and continue to do so while incarcerated.